When I was 16, my mom took me camping in the mountains and left me there. I'm Emily, and the night my childhood ended didn't look dramatic at first. It was just cold air, the smell of smoke, and my mom shoving a cheap multi-tool into my hand. "Go grab some real firewood," she said. "Not that damp junk by the campsite. Time for you to learn how to take care of yourself." I was half asleep, but I went. I wandered off the trail, snapping branches, stuffing them into my arms, trying not to trip over rocks in the dark. No signal, no flashlight, just my phone at 20% and that stupid little knife. I was gone maybe 40 minutes. When I came back through the trees, I heard voices near the tent. I slowed down, more from the tone than the words. "If she wants to survive," my mom said, calm like she was talking about the weather, "she'll figure it out." I froze. For a second I thought I misheard. Then I saw her. The tent was already half down. The cooler was in the back of the SUV. My backpack was on the ground, but everything else? Packed. "Very funny," I laughed, dropping the wood. "You're not actually leaving me here." She didn't laugh. She didn't even look guilty. She just tossed my backpack toward me. "You say you're grown up, right? Prove it." I grabbed the car door, but she peeled my fingers off the handle like they were nothing. The engine started. The headlights swung past my face. A minute later, I was standing alone in the dark with a dying phone, a half-zipped backpack, and the echo of tires on gravel. I thought that was the worst thing my mom could ever do to me. 6 years later, she walked into my job sobbing. And somehow, that hurt even more. Stay with me till the end, and I'll tell you how leaving me in those mountains was only the beginning. When the sound of the car finally faded, the forest got so quiet it hurt. I stood there for a long time, clutching my backpack like it might magically turn into a ride home if I squeezed hard enough. It did not. My phone said 15%. No bars. Just that little SOS symbol mocking me in the corner of the screen. I tried to tell myself this was a twisted camping lesson and they would circle back once I learned my lesson. I waited an hour, then another. The sky went from blue to orange to this deep purple that made the trees look like teeth. No headlights, no engine, no mom. Eventually, the cold pushed through my jacket and forced me to move. I set the backpack down and checked what I actually had. 2 bottles of water, 3 granola bars, a thin hoodie, a cheap plastic poncho, the multi-tool, no map, no charger. I laughed, this sharp, ugly sound that bounced back at me from the trees. 16 years old, and my own mother had basically dropped me in the middle of the Rocky Mountains with the starter pack for a school field trip. I tried to retrace the way we had driven in, following the dirt road that led toward the main campground. The problem was, every cluster of trees and rocks looked exactly the same in the dark. My phone flashlight made a weak little cone that barely reached 10 feet ahead. I kept thinking about all the true crime podcasts my friends loved, all the last seen at a campsite episodes I used to roll my eyes at. Now I could practically hear the narrator in my head, calm and detached, telling strangers how stupid I had been to trust my family. After maybe an hour of walking, I forced myself to stop. If I kept wandering without a plan, I would burn through my energy and get even more lost. So I did what I remembered from the one outdoor education class we had at school. Stay near a landmark. Stay visible. Conserve energy. I dragged some fallen branches into a rough circle and sat with my back against a thick tree, knees pulled up to my chest. The temperature dropped hard after sunset. My teeth started chattering. Every crack of a twig sounded like a bear. I knew most of the wildlife would rather avoid people, but try telling that to my nervous system. I did not sleep that first night as much as I just blacked out in tiny bursts, jerking awake at every sound. In those half-awake moments, I heard my mom's voice from earlier, over and over. If she wants to survive, she will figure it out. People say stuff in anger all the time, but that sentence had been too calm, too measured, like she had been rehearsing it in her head for weeks. Morning came slow and gray. My fingers were stiff, but I could still move them. I forced myself to eat half a granola bar and take small sips of water. I knew from health class that dehydration would kill me faster than anything, but panic would make me chug everything if I let it. During a tiny window when my phone showed 1 bar of signal, I opened an app we used in biology class that identifies plants and berries with the camera. I scanned the bushes nearby just in case. The app marked a few berries as safe, a few as unknown. I only picked the ones it flagged as safe, and even then I waited, chewing slowly, like poison might introduce itself politely before killing me. By noon, I decided I had to move. I followed the sound of running water, figuring if I stayed near a stream I could at least drink and maybe find a trail or other campers. The stream was ice cold, but it tasted cleaner than anything from a bottle. I remembered my teacher saying, moving water is usually safer than still water. Usually. Great word when your life depends on it. By the second night, the fear felt different. Less like a jump scare, more like a heavy coat that would not come off. I stopped expecting my parents' headlights. I stopped imagining this ending with a lecture and a ride home. I started admitting the one thing I did not want to say out loud. They really left me. On purpose. On the third day, my legs shook every time I stood up. My lips were cracked. I had 1 bottle of water left and half a bar. My phone was a dead rectangle in my pocket. I followed a narrow trail along the stream, mostly because it was easier than pushing through brush. That was when I heard it. Voices. Not in my head this time. Real voices. Laughing. The clink of metal against rock. I froze, then forced myself to shout. My voice came out thin at first. I tried again, louder, dragging air up from some stubborn place inside me. Help. The voices went quiet. For a second I thought I had scared them off. Then a man's voice called back, sharp and alert, asking where I was. I stepped out onto the trail, waving both arms. A group of 3 hikers stood a little way ahead, loaded with real gear, big packs, bright jackets, a GPS clipped to one of their straps. They looked at me like I was some kind of ghost. I must have looked like one. Dirt on my face, hair matted, eyes wide. One of them rushed over and put a hand on my shoulder, asking if I was hurt, if I was alone. That was the moment it hit me how bad it really was. I opened my mouth to answer, but all that came out was this broken little sound. Another hiker handed me a protein bar and a foil blanket, the kind they use at marathons. While I ate, they called in my situation on a radio to the park rangers, using words like minor, abandoned, possible neglect. Hearing those words made something inside me sit up. Neglect. Abandoned. It was the first time anyone had labeled what happened to me as something other than discipline. By the time we reached the ranger station, my legs were jelly, and my brain felt like it was lagging a few seconds behind everything. The ranger on duty wrapped me in another blanket and asked for my parents' phone number. My stomach twisted. I gave him my aunt's number instead. When my Aunt Linda pulled up in her old pickup, she ran to me and hugged me so hard my ribs hurt. She kept saying my name, over and over like an apology she did not know how to finish. On the drive to her house, she told me my parents had called her after the trip and said I had run off to punish them. They had not filed a missing person report. They had not called the park. They had gone home, taken showers, gone back to work. That night, lying in my aunt's spare room with clean sheets and a full stomach, I stared at the ceiling and realized something simple and brutal. Getting out of the mountains had been the easy part. The real wilderness was going back to a family who could leave me there in the first place. 6 years later, I was wiping caramel drizzle off a Starbucks counter in Seattle when my past walked in and ordered a latte. By then, the camping trip was something I only mentioned in therapy and anonymous support groups. On paper, I was doing fine. I had moved in with my aunt for a while after the Rangers found me, but it didn't take long for the story to twist. My parents told everyone I had stormed off to teach them a lesson and refused to come home. My Aunt Linda believed me more than they did, but she still used words like misunderstanding and family drama, like almost dying in the woods was the same as a loud Thanksgiving. By 18, I'd had enough. I took on extra shifts, saved every dollar, and moved out. Seattle was far enough from Denver that I could breathe without checking over my shoulder for a familiar SUV. I rented a tiny room in an old house with two other girls I met through an online support group for people raised by abusive parents. We split rent, traded trauma stories over instant ramen, and kept each other's secrets. I got a job as a barista, the kind where your name tag never matches your actual name, and your manager cares more about drive-through times than your mental health. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I blocked my parents on everything: phone, email, social media. If I couldn't fully erase them, I could at least put them behind a wall. When I needed to talk about it, I went to Reddit instead. Late at night, after closing shifts, I'd sit on my mattress on the floor and scroll through RR raised by narcissists and similar subs, reading stories that sounded uncomfortably close to my own. One day, I finally posted mine from a throwaway account. I described the trip, the quote, the days in the mountains, the ranger station. Within hours, there were comments from strangers saying, "That was abuse. That was attempted neglect. You didn't deserve that." It was the first time anyone had called it what it was without flinching. For a while, that was enough. I told myself I didn't need closure. I just needed distance. Then, on a random Wednesday morning shift, she walked in. I was half zoned out, repeating the same greeting I'd said 1,000 times when I felt someone staring a little too hard. I glanced up from the espresso machine and saw a woman at the front of the line who looked like a bad sketch of my mother. Thinner, shoulders slumped, hair shot through with gray, but the eyes were the same, sharp, assessing, like she was evaluating me against some invisible checklist. My brain lagged. My body reacted first. My hands went cold and my chest got tight, like I was back in that forest breathing air that was too thin. Next in line, my coworker called. The woman stepped forward. Her hand shook as she reached for her wallet. "Tall vanilla latte," she said, then added, "Please," like the word hurt. I could have pretended not to recognize her. I could have handed the cup off to someone else, hidden in the back. Anything. Instead, I said her name quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. Her head snapped up. Our eyes locked. For a second, the cafe noise dropped away, and it was just the two of us, and the ghost of that campsite between us. Her face crumpled. Right there, in front of the pastry case, she started to cry. Not pretty movie tears. Full hysterical, shoulders-shaking sobs. Customers turned to stare. My manager peeked out from the back with a tight smile that meant, "Fix this without killing our vibe." I swallowed hard. "We can't block the line," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "If you want to talk, we can do it outside." She nodded too fast, wiping at her face with the back of her hand like she could erase the whole scene. I handed off her drink to my coworker without explaining and told my manager I was taking my break. The air outside slapped me in the face, cool and damp. She was waiting on a bench near the trash cans, clutching a napkin like a lifeline. Up close, the changes were worse. Deep lines around her mouth, dark circles under her eyes, that brittle energy of someone held together by caffeine and fear. "Emily," she said, like my name was a question she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. "I've been looking for you for years." I stayed standing. Distance made it easier to breathe. "You found me," I said. "What do you want?" She launched into it. Apologies, excuses. She said she missed me, that she thought about me every day, that she had made a terrible mistake on that camping trip. When I asked why she hadn't called 911, why she hadn't contacted the park, why she had gone home and slept in her own bed while I was out there counting granola bars and praying not to die, she stumbled. She blamed stress, money, her own childhood. She said she thought I would come back stronger, that she was trying to teach me not to be weak and dependent like she had been. I listened, but the whole time there was this cold, steady voice in the back of my head doing the math. 16 years of being told I was dramatic, ungrateful, too sensitive. 3 days alone in the mountains. 6 years of silence. And now she shows up at my job, crying in front of my customers, demanding a second chance. "You didn't make a mistake," I finally said. "You made a choice. Over and over. You chose not to go back. You chose not to call for help. You chose to lie about it after." She tried to reach for my hand. I stepped back. For a second, something like anger flashed in her eyes, the old version of her I remembered, the one who hated being challenged. Then it dropped back into desperation. "Please," she said, "just have dinner with me. Let me explain everything. We can start over." I almost laughed. Start over. Like there was a reset button somewhere between Denver and Seattle that we had both just forgotten to hit. "No," I said. "You don't get to show up and pretend we're just a normal mother and daughter who had a rough patch. You left me to die in the mountains. That doesn't get erased with coffee and tears." Her face crumpled again. People walking by tried not to stare. Somewhere inside the store, a blender roared to life. The world kept moving while mine narrowed down to one decision. "If you keep coming to my job, if you contact me or my friends again, I'm going to file a report," I added. "I'm not 16 anymore. You don't get to decide what happens to me now." I turned and walked back inside before she could answer. My hands shook as I tied my apron again, but my voice was steady when I called the next drink. I had no idea then that this was just the first move. She wasn't going to let go easily, and I was done pretending what she did to me was anything less than abuse. I wish I could say that warning outside the coffee shop was the end of it, that she got the message and disappeared back into whatever life she had ruined without me, but that would have been too easy. For a week or two, nothing happened. I went to work, closed shifts, wiped counters, and tried not to flinch every time the door chimed. I convinced myself I had been dramatic, that maybe she really would respect a boundary for once. Then, the emails started. At first they came from an address I didn't recognize, with a generic name, like she thought I'd be more likely to open it if I didn't know it was her. The subject line just said, "Please." Inside, the message was a wall of text, no paragraphs, just her spilling everything she thought would make me feel sorry for her. She wrote about how hard things had gotten after the incident, the way she phrased leaving me in the mountains like it was a car accident instead of a decision. She said my dad, Mark, had never really backed her up and eventually turned on her, which I translated as finally admitted she went too far. She said he'd filed for divorce 2 years after I left for Seattle. She wrote that my younger brother, Dylan, had dropped out of community college, that he was addicted to video games and barely left his room. She said she had lost her job as a store manager because she couldn't focus and her bosses didn't understand. In between the pity party, there were these little jabs, lines like, "You ran away from your family," and "We all suffered because of your choice not to come home." It was like she physically could not tell a story without casting herself as the victim and me as the problem. I didn't reply. I blocked that email. She made another one. When the emails didn't work, she tried LinkedIn, which I hadn't even realized was connected to my personal email. She sent a connection request with a note that said, "I'm proud of you," like she had any right to be proud of anything I had done without her. She found my roommates on Instagram and sent them long messages about how much she loved me and how worried she was. She contacted my Aunt Linda and asked her to pressure me to talk. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach flipped. It wasn't just annoying. It felt like being dragged back into a house I had worked so hard to escape. One night, after a double shift and 3 new messages from fake accounts that were obviously her, I sat on the edge of my mattress and stared at my phone for a long time. I pulled up the non-emergency number for the Seattle police and hovered over the call button. Part of me still heard her voice, telling me I was overreacting, that people call the cops on real criminals, not on their own mom. That part of me was 16 and scared. The rest of me was 22 and exhausted. I hit call. I told the woman on the line that I had been abandoned as a minor on a camping trip in Colorado, and that the parent who did it had now found me and would not stop contacting me after I asked her to stop. The dispatcher transferred me to an officer who specialized in domestic situations. He listened, asked questions, and did not once call it a misunderstanding. He explained that what happened in Colorado was something I would need to report there if I wanted to push it, and that the statute of limitations might be complicated. But the harassment now, the unwanted contact at my job and through my friends, that they could address. He suggested I document every message, every email, every attempt to reach me, and then come down to file a report so they could issue an official warning. I did exactly that. Screenshots, dates, times. The shaky video my coworker had taken from behind the counter the day she cried in the shop, which suddenly felt useful instead of embarrassing. A week later, I sat in a small gray room at the station, hands folded in my lap, and watched an officer type my words into a report. It felt surreal, seeing mother and harassment on the same line in an official document. After that, things got quiet again, but it wasn't real silence. It was the silence you get right before a storm. One Saturday afternoon, my aunt called. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my chest told me to pick up. Linda sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard before. She told me my mom, Sandra, had driven down to her house unannounced, banging on the door, demanding to know why I had turned the police on her. According to my aunt, Sandra was ranting about how I was ruining her life, how people at her new job looked at her differently, how some distant cousin had sent her a link to a Reddit post that sounded a little too familiar. That got my attention. I hadn't used names, but I had mentioned the Rockies, the age, the quote. Apparently, it had been enough for someone in the extended family to connect the dots. Linda said she had tried to calm Sandra down, but my mom just kept circling back to the same line. I was just trying to make her strong. No one made me strong. I had to do it myself. That was the opening my aunt needed. She told me gently that there was something about my mom's past she had never really talked about. When Sandra was around 10, their own mother had left her in a public park for hours as punishment for talking back. No phone, no watch, no idea when she'd be picked up. Their mother had gone shopping, had coffee with a friend, and returned smiling like nothing had happened. To her, it was a lesson. She never really got over it, my aunt said. She convinced herself that's why she's tough. That's how she survived. She thinks doing it to you was giving you the same gift. My aunt's voice cracked on the last word. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling something cold and sharp slide into place. It didn't make what my mom did any less evil, but it finally made it make sense. Hurt people is a nice phrase for a poster. It hits different when you realize you are the person they chose to pass the hurt to. A few days later, my mom emailed again. This time, instead of begging or guilt-tripping, she wanted a meeting. One real conversation, she wrote. No yelling. I'll answer anything. Against my better judgment, I agreed, but on my terms. Public place. Daylight. I told her we could meet at a park near my apartment, the one with lots of dog walkers and kids and nowhere for anyone to corner anyone else. When I got there, she was already on a bench, clutching a to-go cup in both hands like it might run away. She looked even smaller than before. For a minute, neither of us spoke. "I heard about your childhood," I said finally. "About Grandma leaving you in the park." She flinched like I'd slapped her. Then she laughed. This short, bitter sound. "Of course Linda told you that." She went on autopilot, telling the story like she'd clearly told it 100 times. How no one came when she cried. How she decided that day never to depend on anyone. How she had sworn her kids would be tougher than she was. When she finished, she looked up at me, eyes shiny. "I didn't want you to be a victim, Emily. I wanted you to know you could survive anything." I took a slow breath. "You wanted me to survive, so you created the danger yourself. Do you hear how insane that sounds?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, she didn't have a comeback. "You keep saying you were trying to help me," I said. "But every choice you made put me in more danger, not less. Leaving me in the mountains, not calling for help, lying about it, finding me years later and pushing into my life after I told you no. That's not love. That's control." Something in her posture sagged. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked confused instead of confident. Lost, even. "So what now?" she whispered. "You just never talk to me again?" I thought about the police report, about the emails, about the teenager inside me who still woke up some nights convinced she was alone in the woods. "What happens now is you stop contacting me," I said. "You respect the fact that I don't feel safe around you. You get real help from someone whose job it is to fix people like you, not from the daughter you traumatized." Her eyes filled again. She reached for me, but I stepped back, just out of reach. The old anger flashed and faded in her face, replaced by something like fear. "If you ignore the warning and keep reaching out," I added, "there will be more reports. That's not a threat. That's a boundary." I turned to leave. Behind me, she called my name, then let it fall. As I walked home, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. I didn't open it. The line had finally been drawn in ink instead of pencil. I didn't know it yet, but she was about to cross it in a way that gave me all the fuel I needed to start telling the world exactly what she had done. I didn't open that email on the walk home, but it didn't really matter. She found another way to shove herself into my life. A few days after our park conversation, one of my roommates knocked on my door with her phone in her hand and this weird look on her face. "Hey," she said carefully. "So, I think your mom just messaged me." My stomach dropped. On my roommate's screen was a long DM from an account with my mom's face as the profile picture. She had written paragraphs about how I was mentally unstable, how I had run away and cut ties with my loving family, how she was terrified I was being influenced by dangerous people online. She asked my roommate to let her know if I was okay, like I was a missing dog and not a grown woman paying my own rent. I felt my face go hot. It wasn't just the invasion, it was the way she twisted the story, again, this time to someone who actually knew me. "You can block her," I said quietly. My roommate already had. "I just thought you should know." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my heart beating too fast. Blocking her was like bailing water out of a sinking boat with a cup. As long as she controlled the story, she would keep using it to pry at the cracks in my life. I kept thinking about that ranger, about the words he'd used in his report. Neglect. Abandoned. I thought about the 100 anonymous strangers on Reddit who had told me this wasn't my fault. At some point, an idea clicked into place. If she was going to keep lying, maybe it was time to stop whispering the truth in safe little corners of the internet and start saying it louder. I started small. I logged back into the throwaway account I'd used on Reddit and updated my post with more details. I talked about the quote, If she wants to survive, she'll figure it out. I talked about waiting for headlights that never came, about the ranger station, about finding out later that no one had filed a missing person report. I didn't use names or locations this time either, just enough context to paint the picture. Then I stayed up until 2 in the morning reading the responses. People shared their own horror stories. A few said it sounded criminal. One comment hit me hard. Abusers count on your silence. They taught you to protect them, not yourself. I realized that was exactly what I'd been doing. The next step scared me more. One afternoon, on my day off, I propped my phone against a stack of books, opened TikTok, and stared at my own face in the front camera. I almost backed out. Instead, I flipped the camera, filmed my hands twisting a coffee cup on my lap, and started talking. When I was 16, I said, my mom took me camping in the Rockies and left me there alone. I told the story in pieces, the way people do when they're just dumping something wild into the universe. No names, no identifying details. Just the facts and the way it felt to hear her say that sentence and realize she meant it. I added text captions for accessibility, put a random trending audio at low volume, and hit post before I could overthink it. I figured maybe a few hundred people would see it, mostly strangers scrolling past on their lunch break. By the end of the week, it had over 400,000 views. The comments were a mix of outrage and heartbreak. This is abuse. I'm so sorry, I believe you. My mom did something similar. I thought I was alone. A few trolls said I was making it up for clout, but the weight of the support drowned them out. For the first time, the story wasn't just stuck in my throat or hidden in some private subreddit. It was out there, breathing on its own. That probably would have been enough for me, honestly, just telling it. But then my aunt called again. She sounded frazzled. I don't know what you posted, she said, but your mother is losing it. Someone sent her a link to a video that sounds a lot like your trip. She's convinced you're trying to destroy her. I almost laughed. The idea that me describing what she had done counted as destroying her said everything. Still, it got me wondering what her looked like now. Not as my mom, as a person. A woman with a life, with a job, with a reputation she clearly valued more than my safety. So I did something I'd avoided for years. I searched her name. It wasn't hard to find her. New city, same state. She had a small online shop and a couple of social media pages where she presented herself as a hardworking single mom who had overcome so much and now sold home goods and wellness products. Every caption was a mix of hustle culture and emotional manipulation. Family is everything. Never give up on your kids. Little knives twisted into my ribs with every scroll. The reviews on her business were mostly good, but not all. A handful of people complained about late orders, missing items, her being rude over email. Nothing major, just red flags that looked a lot bigger when you knew who she was. I didn't need to invent anything. All I had to do was tell the truth in the places that mattered. I made a second TikTok, this time talking about how some abusers managed to spin themselves into inspiring figures in their communities. Again, no names, no business details, just the pattern. The video stitched easily with my first one. People started asking in the comments how she could just walk away from abandoning a kid without consequences. Because I stayed quiet, I answered. Because those of us who lived it were taught to protect her image. Then I went to the review pages for her business. I didn't dox her. I didn't link my videos. I didn't tell people to harass her. All I did was leave one careful, honest review under my real first name. I gave 3 stars and wrote that the products had arrived, but the person behind the business had a history of severe emotional abuse and neglect, including abandoning her own child on a camping trip as discipline and never reporting them missing. I said that customers deserved to know the character of the person they were supporting. I hit submit and walked away from the laptop like it might explode. For a few days, nothing obvious happened. Then, little ripples started showing up. A former coworker of hers found my TikTok and commented that my story sounded way too familiar. A distant cousin messaged me privately, saying they had always suspected something worse had happened on that trip. But every time they asked, my mom shut them down. A woman who recognized my mom's face from my aunt's Facebook sent me screenshots of my mom's own posts, where she was now ranting about online bullies and cancel culture and a certain ungrateful daughter. The more she tried to clap back, the worse she looked. She made a video of her own, crying about how I had twisted the truth and edited out my own bad behavior. But she slipped. She repeated the quote, "If she wants to survive, she'll figure it out." People in her comments froze on that sentence. You could see it in the way the replies shifted from, "You're a great mom," to, "Wait, what?" and "You did what?" Her follower count dipped. Some of her customers began asking public questions. Had she really left a teenager alone in the mountains? Had she actually never called for help? On one of her business pages, a new review popped up from someone I didn't know. "I can't in good conscience support someone who admits to abusing their own child and calls it tough love." It snowballed from there. She tried to argue with strangers, to reframe, to gaslight people who hadn't even been there. The more she talked, the less control she had over the narrative. That's the thing about the internet. It can be cruel and unforgiving, yes. But sometimes it's the only place where people like my mom can't completely rewrite history without anyone checking the receipts. Sitting on my mattress in that tiny Seattle room, watching it all unfold on a cracked phone screen, I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. I felt something colder, steadier. For the first time, I wasn't outnumbered. For the first time, when she lied, there were thousands of people ready to ask the questions I'd been screaming into a void for years. And I knew, deep down, this was only the first wave. Real consequences were coming. The consequences didn't hit all at once. They came in waves, the way a storm rolls onto a beach, each one a little bigger than the last. The first wave was the comments. Under my mom's own posts, you could see the shift happen in real time. At first, her followers told her she was strong, that kids these days were soft, that we all got spanked and turned out fine. Then someone clipped her sentence about leaving me in the mountains and posted it on their own account with the caption, "This isn't discipline, this is abuse." That clip took off. Suddenly, strangers who had never heard of her were stitching her video, arguing in their own kitchens and bedrooms about what counted as tough love and what was just straight-up cruelty. My mom tried to keep posting her usual content, smiling with her products and typing long captions about resilience, but the replies were different now. "Are you the one who left your kid in the Rockies? Did you ever actually call the cops? Why are you selling candles instead of apologizing?" She deleted the worst comments, then turned them off completely. But the internet doesn't forget. People took screenshots. They shared them in private Facebook groups and local forums. One night, while I was counting the till at work, my phone buzzed with a DM from someone I didn't recognize. They said they used to work with my mom at the store she managed. "We always knew she had a temper," they wrote. "We just didn't know it was this bad. I'm sorry no one saw it sooner." A different message came from one of her recent customers who had ordered a big batch of products for a small boutique and gotten half of it late and wrong. She'd seen my review and connected the dots. "I thought she was just scatterbrained," the woman wrote. "Now I think she's dangerous." That woman and a handful of other customers filed complaints, not just on the review sites but through actual consumer channels. A few took her to small claims court over undelivered orders and refused refunds. I only found out because someone sent me a copy of the docket, her name printed in black and white next to the words failure to provide goods as promised. There was something darkly satisfying about that phrase, failure to provide. It fit more than just candles and throw pillows. My aunt called again, exhausted. She told me my mom had been served papers at her apartment and had shown up at a family gathering ranting about how I had weaponized the internet against her. Some relatives agreed with her. Others, the ones who had quietly watched from the sidelines all these years, started asking questions they'd never dared ask before. What really happened on that camping trip? Why hadn't she called for help? Why had she lied? Every time she told the story, the details slipped a little, and someone would point it out. The control she'd had over the narrative all my life was cracking in front of her. That was the second wave. The third was uglier. A cousin sent me a photo of her sitting alone in her living room, blinds half closed in the middle of the day, surrounded by boxes of unsold inventory. The landlord had raised her rent, and between that and legal fees and refunding angry customers, she was barely hanging on. My brother Dylan texted me for the first time in years. His message was short and awkward, full of typos like he'd rushed it. "Mom's freaking out," he wrote. "She keeps saying you're trying to destroy her. I don't even know what to believe anymore." I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "You don't have to pick a side," I wrote back. "You just have to decide what's true. She left me in the mountains. She never called for help. Those are facts." There was a long pause. Then he replied, "I remember that trip. I remember her telling Dad I'd thank her one day for being so hard on us. I thought she was just being dramatic." He didn't defend her. He didn't defend me either. But for the first time, it felt like he was standing in the actual middle, not on her team by default. More ripples. More waves. A local Facebook mom group picked up the story, not because of me, but because one of her customers posted a warning about buying from influencers with hidden pasts. The comments tore into her. A few defended her, but most didn't. They weren't there for our family drama. They were there as parents asking themselves a hard question. Would I ever do that to my kid? Watching strangers argue over your trauma is surreal. Part of me wanted to close the app and never open it again. Another part couldn't look away. It was like sitting in the back row of a courtroom where your life was the case file. Eventually, I realized I needed to say one more thing, not to the internet, but to her. Not for her benefit, for mine. I opened a blank email and started typing. I didn't bother with "Dear Mom." I laid out everything she had done, point by point, like a ledger. Leaving me in the mountains, not calling the Rangers, lying to the family, showing up in Seattle to demand a second chance without ever really owning what she'd done. Messaging my friends, painting me as unstable, turning herself into a victim online while I quietly tried to build a life she had no part of. Then I wrote the sentence that had been sitting in my throat since the ranger station. "You taught me that surviving meant staying quiet so you didn't have to feel guilty. I'm done protecting you from the truth. I'm allowed to tell my story. If that has consequences for you, those are your consequences, not my cruelty." I told her that any further harassment would go straight to the police and that if she wanted less hate online, she could start by apologizing without excuses, both privately and publicly. I ended it with a line I knew would hit harder than anything else. "For the record, I didn't ruin your life. You did. The internet just finally saw it." I hit send and felt, not relief exactly, more like a bone settling back into its socket after being out of place for too long. A week later, my aunt called with the update I'd been expecting and dreading. My mom had lost one of the small claims cases and had to refund money she didn't have. Her landlord had given her notice. She'd shown up to work at a part-time retail job so shaken and exhausted that her manager sent her home, and she'd had what the ER called a mental health crisis. They admitted her to a psychiatric ward on a short-term hold after she hinted that maybe everyone would be better off without her. When my aunt said the words hospital and psychiatric, I sat down on the edge of my bed. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just felt this hollow, echoing quiet inside my chest. This was what I'd wanted, right? Consequences. For her to finally feel even a fraction of the fear and helplessness she'd handed me on that mountain. But hearing she had actually broken scared me in a way I hadn't prepared for. Not because I wanted her to be okay, not exactly, because it proved just how deep the rot went. Hurt people, hurt people. And now, the person who had spent her whole life pretending she was the strongest one in every room was lying in a hospital bed, finally unable to spin away from what she'd done. That night, Dylan texted again. "They put her in some kind of mental place," he wrote. "She keeps asking for you." I stared at that message until the words blurred. Part of me wanted to throw my phone across the room. Another part remembered the feeling of that cold mountain air clawing at my lungs. "I'm sorry this is happening," I typed back. "None of this is your fault. But I'm not the one she needs right now. She needs a therapist, not a daughter she traumatized." I hit send and turned my phone off. Revenge, it turned out, didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like finally telling the truth, watching the person who hurt you face it, and realizing there was no version of this story where everyone walked away whole. I didn't talk to her while she was in the hospital. I let doctors and therapists do their jobs without inserting myself back into the center of her storm. Weeks passed. I went to work, made lattes, closed shifts, and on my days off, I started attending a support group in person instead of just lurking online. It was a bunch of us sitting in a church basement or community center, sharing stories that all sounded different on the surface but had the same core. Someone who was supposed to protect us decided they had the right to break us instead. Saying it out loud in that room felt different than typing it on a screen. It felt more real, and strangely, more survivable. Somewhere in there, my TikToks passed 1 million views. I didn't make more to chase it. I made a few follow-ups to answer questions from people who were clearly still stuck in situations I'd already escaped. I talked about safety plans, about saving money quietly, about therapy and legal aid and hotlines. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was information, I guess. A way of telling the version of 16-year-old me who was still out there in someone else's body that she wasn't crazy and she wasn't alone. Eventually, my aunt called to say the hospital had released my mom on a treatment plan. She was in some kind of outpatient program, on medication, forced to sit in rooms and talk about feelings she'd spent her whole life stuffing down behind brittle jokes and control. My aunt said my mom wanted to call me. The old script kicked in immediately. "She's sick. She needs you. You're her daughter." But I wasn't that girl anymore. I told my aunt I would take one call, one time, on speaker, with her in the room. No secrets, no rewrites. When the phone finally rang and I heard my mom's voice, it startled me how small she sounded. Not sharp, not commanding, just tired. She apologized. Really apologized, in a way she never had before. "No, but? No, if you hadn't? No, you know I meant well." She said she had told her therapist everything, and for the first time had to listen to someone say the words child abuse without flinching it away. She said she had been so desperate not to feel like a victim that she turned herself into the villain instead. She cried, and I believed she was sorry. I did. But believing someone is sorry and trusting them not to hurt you again are not the same thing. When she finally asked, "Can we start over?" I took a breath and told her the truth. I told her I was glad she was getting help. I told her I did not wish her dead or even miserable. I also told her that my life in Seattle, the one I had built without her, was not a punishment. It was a boundary. That forgiveness, if it ever came, would be something I did for myself, not a prize she could win by saying the right words. That there might never be a version of our relationship that looked like what she wanted, and she had to make peace with that in therapy, not in my inbox. She went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I understand," in a way that told me she finally knew understanding and accepting were two different mountains to climb. We hung up. I didn't feel lighter or heavier. I just felt done. Not with healing, because that's not a switch you flip, but with chasing some imaginary moment where everything would finally make sense and hurt less. That wasn't coming. What I had instead was a tiny apartment that was mine, friends who believed me, a scarred but beating heart, and this strange, fierce urge to pull other people out of the places I'd barely escaped. So I leaned into that. I kept going to group. I volunteered with a local hotline that helped people dealing with domestic and family abuse. Sometimes, when it was appropriate, I shared a soft version of my story. Not the internet drama, not the viral parts. Just the girl in the woods who realized her mother loved control more than she loved her kid, and the woman who decided that cycle ended with her. People like to dress up what happened to me with phrases like tough love or survival training. Here's what I learned. Love that leaves you alone and terrified on a mountain isn't love. Love that demands your silence to protect its own reputation isn't love. Tough love without safety, accountability, and consent is just abuse in a nicer outfit. If you see yourself in any of this, I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers. I'm just some girl who got left in the Rockies and decided not to stay lost. But I can tell you this much. You're allowed to name what happened to you. You're allowed to set boundaries that make other people uncomfortable. You're allowed to walk away from family if staying means slowly disappearing. Revenge, for me, wasn't ruining her life. It was refusing to let her version of the story be the only one that survived. So if you're listening to this and thinking about your own camping trip, whatever that looked like, I hope you tell someone, a friend, a therapist, a stranger on the internet who gets it. And if you feel like it, share this story, or your own, so the next kid out there in the dark knows there's a way out, and a whole world waiting on the other side.